Ira Cogardius Latsa Capahan Estanium Mar and Ira Core. Minister, I just want to begin by congratulating you on your appointment into this office. I have to say I followed with great admiration, like other colleagues, your work in your previous role during a very challenging and difficult time, and I think you served that position with great distinction. I want to begin by echoing the words of condolences for Detective Garda Colm Horgan, and if the Chair will allow me, I just want to take the opportunity very quickly, Minister, to send condolences to the family of young Noah Donoghue from Belfast, who unfortunately went missing and his body was recovered in recent days. Our thoughts go out to his mother and all of his many friends and family. Minister, it has been stated already in terms of our approach to this item in the Dáil, and you'll forgive me, I hope you don't mind. I don't like doing it, Minister, but I have to read my notes off my phone because we had some technical difficulties in terms of trying to get it printed out, so please excuse me for doing that. Minister, for too long, the annual debate on the renewal of these emergency provisions has been characterised not by a proper examination of either of the provisions or their effectiveness, but by the historical political marriage to this legislation by both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. For the record, we aren't debating the continuation of the Special Criminal Court, nor indeed the principle of non-jury courts at all. That is contained in primary legislation. What we're being asked to renew is emergency provisions. By its nature, emergency legislation should be needed to deal with an emergency. And whatever the circumstances that existed when these powers and your perspective on them were first passed, those circumstances plainly do not exist now. There isn't any emergency in 2020. What there is communities up and down this state, in communities up and down this state is ongoing issues with serious organised crime. These emergency provisions didn't stop the heroin barons in the 1980s. The John Gilligans and others of the 1990s, and the Kinahans and their likes in the 2000s, getting mega rich on the backs of ordinary, decent, many working class communities, while the political class sat in here, nodding these provisions through year upon year with little or no regard for what was actually needed to deal with serious organised crime. What we need put in place is in the 21st century is 21st century law that will deal with 21st century criminal gangs. Criminal gangs which are no respecter of national borders, criminal gangs which operate on a global scale, and criminal gangs which very often operate entirely online. Do people seriously expect legislation that came about, much of it drafted in the 1930s, would be able to deal with these modern challenges? We owe it as legislators to the people who send us here to actually examine what it is we are voting on. We owe it to the communities who are ravaged by the activities of international criminal gangs to put in place the necessary legal framework to allow the courts and the Gardaí to do their jobs effectively. That's why Sinn Féin have called for a review of these powers. The current legislation has failed communities. Those failures are written in the blood of those young people killed in feuds. Those failures are written in the lives lost to heroin and other drugs. Those failures are seen each time a parent ends up trying to scrape together money to pay off a child's drug debt to try and save their life in the face of threats from thugs. The reason we called for a review is about creating the space over the next year to put together a piece of primary legislation which isn't couched in an emergency, which isn't reliant on an annual review, and which isn't contaminated by annual political discourse, but which puts in place a 21st century legal framework aimed at keeping our communities safe. Surely we can collectively build a political consensus around that aim. Surely we can bring a proper focus on what is required in the Ireland of today, not fighting political battles over a piece of legislation from another time. Indeed, Minister, it's worth noting that the Good Friday Agreement itself, endorsed overwhelmingly by the Irish people 22 years ago, made the following demand. And I quote, "The Irish Government will initiate a wide-ranging review of the Offences Against the State Acts 1939 to 85, with a view to both reform and dispensing with those elements no longer required as circumstances permit." So in conclusion, I would appeal to other parties and stakeholders to open the door to a better way through the review process, to abandon the notion of emergency powers, to move to the space of giving the Gardaí and the courts the tools to keep our communities safe, to do it in a mature, sensible and grown-up way, to take counsel from those on the front line, and then go about framing a piece of effective legislation that can become the start of a new way of tackling criminal challenges which the Ireland of 2020 faces. Minister, we have called for that review, as you know, and you referenced it in your own contribution opening here this evening, and other colleagues have referenced it. I hope, while appreciating it was announced very recently, and you have only come into post in the last few days, I appreciate that, but you may be in a position to facilitate us, for the purposes of the record and our information, some of what you understand that review to be, what you hope it'll be, what you intend as Minister to do with that review, so that all of the points, not just raised by me, but indeed all of the points raised by colleagues right across their perspectives and their political views can be taken on board, and that we can assist you, that we can work collaboratively, that we can work positively with the shared stated aim of trying to get a piece of legislation that works effectively, that is human rights compliant, and that ultimately works to keep those communities who are suffering the most safe from the criminal gangs who are putting them under such threat. Gar maith, Carly.